Have you ever been judged by what you wear, the seat you choose, or the way you look long before anyone knows your story? Imagine sitting quietly at an airport, holding nothing more than an economy ticket, only to hear strangers laugh, sneer, and whisper that you don't belong. Now ask yourself, what if the very place they mocked you in was yours? This is not just about arrogance at a boarding gate. It's about a choice we all face when others strip away your dignity. Do you fight back with anger, or do you stand firm with quiet strength that speaks louder than insults? If it were you, sitting in that worn jacket, would you shrink under their contempt, or would you let your character reveal the truth tonight? We bring you a story of humiliation turned into revelation, of arrogance colliding with power built on respect, a story that forces us to reflect what is the true measure of a person. Stay with us, and let this journey move you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another story that reminds us of the dignity we all deserve. The Aurora International Terminal hummed like a restless machine. Screens blinked with updates, boarding groups shifted in and out like tides, and the low murmur of voices wove into a constant buzz. To most people, this was simply an airport waiting lounge. But to David Cole, sitting quietly with a paperback balanced on his palm, it was more than that. He knew every joint, every beam, every cable hidden behind the polished glass walls. He had walked these halls when they were just blueprints and dust. And now, on a Tuesday afternoon, he sat among hundreds of travelers with nothing more than a wrinkled economy boarding pass in his jacket pocket. David did not look like the kind of man who could alter the trajectory of empires. His leather jacket was cracked at the seams, the zipper replaced by a bent paper clip. His jeans were faded, softened by years of wear. The boots on his feet still carried faint stains of concrete dust from construction sites decades ago. His silver hair was cropped close, his posture steady but unassuming. On his lap rested a weathered copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. The corners were folded, the cover scratched from countless journeys. For David, this book was more than philosophy. It was survival. It was a reminder that dignity was not a gift given by the world, but something you held on to even when the world tried to strip it away. Across the lounge, laughter pierced the steady hum of travelers. A family entered as though the terminal had been built solely for them. They were wrapped in Gucci, Balenciaga, and the kind of polished arrogance that made space around them shrink. Richard Whitmore, the father, led the march. His Rolex caught the fluorescent lights as he swung his arm with the confidence of a man who thought wealth was a passport to respect. Elaine, his wife, clutched a pristine white handbag against her chest, her nose already wrinkling in distaste at the crowd. Their children, Bradley and Chloe, trailed behind, faces illuminated by their phones, too consumed by social media to notice anyone in the room. But Richard noticed David, and Elaine noticed him too. Seriously, Elaine whispered, but loud enough for a dozen passengers to hear. She gestured toward the empty seats beside David. "We have to sit next to that?" Richard rolled his eyes but obeyed. "Just for a moment, darling. We'll be in first class soon, away from all this." The family lowered themselves into the seats with the heaviness of disdain. Chloe, still glued to her phone, muttered, "It smells like poverty here." Bradley snorted, adding, "And old books. Who even reads those anymore?" David turned another page of Meditations, his fingers steady. The quiet sound of paper brushing against paper was his answer. Elaine sighed theatrically, pulled out a bottle of lavender hand sanitizer, and rubbed her hands as if cleansing herself from invisible contamination. Her handbag landed with a deliberate thud on the seat between her and David, a barrier of leather and pride. The Whitmores laughed again, louder this time. Their amusement echoed across the lounge, blending with the announcements and rolling luggage wheels, but cutting deeper than any overhead speaker. They had found their entertainment a man they assumed was beneath them. They didn't know he was the one who had made it possible for them to sit there at all. David closed his eyes briefly, inhaling. He remembered being 10 years old, standing with his mother in a grocery store when the manager accused her of trying to steal bread she had already paid for. He remembered the sting of humiliation when the man refused to apologize, even after the mistake was clear. That day, his mother had leaned down and whispered, "Respect is free, but priceless. Don't ever let them make you forget your worth." That memory lived in him like a scar, painful but guiding. And now, as the Whitmores laughed, that scar reminded him of who he was. He opened his eyes, calm as still water, and returned to his book. But calm waters often hide storms underneath, and the Whitmores were about to learn how quickly their reflection could shatter. The boarding lounge grew tense. Passengers shifted in their seats, some sneaking glances at David, others glaring at the Whitmores with quiet disapproval. A young couple in the corner pulled out a phone, recording discreetly. They sensed something brewing. Richard leaned forward, looking past David toward the gate agent. "Excuse me, miss," he called, snapping his fingers. His voice carried the sharpness of entitlement. Sophie Tran, a young gate agent in a navy blazer, flinched slightly but approached with her professional smile. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" "My family and I are flying first class," Richard announced, as if declaring a royal title. "This seating situation is unacceptable. Is there nowhere else for us to sit?" Sophie glanced around the packed lounge. "I'm sorry, sir. Boarding will begin in about 20 minutes, and all the seats are taken." "That's not good enough," Elaine cut in, her voice slicing through the air. She tilted her head toward David without even looking him in the eyes. "Perhaps this gentleman would be more comfortable standing elsewhere. I'm sure he wouldn't mind." The room fell quieter. David closed his book. The cover shut with a soft thud that carried farther than any shout. He placed it gently on his backpack and, for the first time, lifted his gaze to meet Elaine's. His eyes were steady, deep, and calm. He didn't say a word. He just looked. And in that silence, something shifted. Elaine, who moments earlier wielded contempt like a weapon, faltered. Her eyes darted away, unsettled by a dignity she couldn't pierce. The battle had begun, but only one side knew what kind of war it was. The silence that followed David Cole's calm stare seemed to stretch longer than the ticking of any clock on the wall. People shifted uneasily in their chairs. Even the children in the lounge, restless only moments before, grew still. Elaine Whitmore cleared her throat and looked away, fumbling with her handbag. She had expected pushback, maybe even anger. What she hadn't expected was the weight of a gaze that felt like it carried decades of storms. David leaned back in his seat, shoulders relaxed, hands folded loosely in his lap. His calmness wasn't passive, it was deliberate, like a man who knew exactly who he was and didn't need to prove it to anyone. But inside, his mind wasn't as still. He thought about the reason he was here today, not business, not contracts, not meetings. He was flying to Chicago for the funeral of his old mentor, a man named Samuel Green. Samuel had been the first foreman to give David a chance when he was barely 18, just a kid from Detroit with rough hands and no resume. Samuel had handed him a toolbox and said, "Respect the tools, respect yourself, and you'll build things that last." Now, Samuel was gone. The weight of that loss pressed against David's chest even as the Whitmores laughed beside him. He wasn't here as the billionaire CEO of Coalport Global. He wasn't the man who had overseen the construction of Aurora Terminal, one of the most advanced transportation hubs in the country. He was just David, a son of working parents, a student of a foreman's wisdom, a man who still carried scars of every slight he had endured along the way. And maybe that was why he had chosen economy for this trip, to strip away the armor of status, to sit once more as the boy who had once taken buses across town with a second-hand jacket and a lunch packed in wax paper, to remember what humility felt like. But humility was not the same as humiliation. The Whitmores could not tell the difference. Richard leaned back in his seat with a smirk. "You see, darling," he said to Elaine, loud enough for David and half the gate to hear, "this is what I mean about standards. Money isn't everything, but presentation is everything. Some people never learn that." Bradley chuckled, glancing at David's boots. Those things looked like they crawled out of a construction site. David didn't answer. He thought again of Samuel's words. Measure twice, cut once. That applies to your words too. Sophie Tran, the young gate agent, stood frozen nearby, clutching her tablet like a shield. She could sense the tension rising, see the crowd's eyes darting between the wealthy family and the quiet man they mocked. She wanted to step in. But protocol was tricky. First-class passengers, especially elite ones like Richard claimed to be, carried weight with the airline, and Sophie, 26, working double shifts to pay off her student loans, had no desire to become the target of their wrath. Still, she hated the way they spoke about him, as if he were invisible, as if he didn't belong. David noticed her discomfort. His eyes softened when they met hers. "Miss," he said, his tone low and kind, "you're doing your job. Don't worry about me." The gentleness in his voice surprised her. She nodded slightly, grateful, though the knot in her stomach remained. David's calm was only surface deep. Beneath it, memories churned. He remembered being thrown out of a hotel lobby at 22, told he didn't fit the image while waiting for a colleague. He remembered a client who once looked him in the eye and asked if he was the driver when David had been the one running the meeting. He remembered, too, the anger he had carried in those years, a hot and restless flame. It had threatened to consume him until he realized something vital. Anger was a currency. And if you spent it on people who weren't worth it, you ended up broke. So he had learned patience, discipline, a stillness that unsettled those who thrived on chaos. That stillness was his shield now. Across the lounge, Chloe lifted her phone, recording a short video for her followers. Sitting in first class but stuck next to some rando in rags, she whispered into the camera. Send help. Her followers would later see more than she intended. Richard snapped his fingers again, calling out to Sophie, "Miss, seriously, can't you find somewhere else for him? My wife is uncomfortable. We are premium customers, and this situation is unacceptable." Sophie's professional smile wavered. She glanced at David, then back at Richard. "Sir, this is the general seating area for Gate 17. All passengers are welcome to sit here until boarding. Elaine scoffed. All passengers. He's flying in the back of the plane. His ticket probably costs less than my lunch. There should be standards. Murmurs rippled through the lounge. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others exchanged disapproving glances. A young man across the aisle raised his phone and began recording discreetly. David took a slow breath. He could feel the familiar ache of being reduced to less than human, of being measured by the shine of his jacket instead of the content of his character. He closed his book and spoke, his voice low but clear. This is a public seating area. First come, first served. I am waiting for my flight, just like you. His words were simple, factual, undeniable, and yet they landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the room. Richard's face flushed. Now you listen here, he said. Rising to his feet, he puffed out his chest, towering slightly over David. My family and I paid a significant amount for our tickets. That comes with expectations, comfort, security. Your presence is making my wife uncomfortable. David raised an eyebrow. My presence or my jacket? The directness of the question hit Richard like a slap. He sputtered, searching for a reply, but found none. The tension was thick now. Sophie stepped forward, her voice trembling. Please, let's all remain calm. Everyone has the right to sit here until their boarding group is called. Elaine leaned forward, her voice shrill. No, this is about standards. People like him drag everything down. He's probably some charity case. The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp. A few passengers gasped. Someone whispered, "That's too far." David felt the first flicker of anger rise. For a moment, he saw his mother again, scrubbing floors late at night so he could buy textbooks. He saw his father's calloused hands gripping a bus steering wheel. He thought of Samuel Green, who had told him once, "The world will try to shrink you. Don't let it." He steadied himself. Then he turned to Sophie, his voice even. "Miss, is there a problem with my ticket?" Sophie blinked, startled. "No. Sir, your ticket is perfectly valid. Am I in the wrong seating area?" "No, sir. This is the correct area." Then David said, turning his gaze back to Richard, "The issue is not with the airline. It is with your prejudice." The room fell into stunned silence. Richard's jaw tightened. He jabbed a finger toward David. "Prejudice. Don't you dare. I'm the furthest thing from prejudiced. We donate to youth programs every year. This is about decorum, about standards of presentation." David's voice sharpened, but his tone remained steady. "The standards you speak of are about the thickness of a wallet, not the quality of a person. You've made assumptions about me based on my clothes. You've insulted me loudly and publicly, and you've done so with an arrogance that is breathtaking." Bradley finally looked up from his phone, sneering. "Chill out. Dude, my dad could buy and sell you 10 times over." David turned his gaze on the boy. "Respect is earned. Son, not inherited. And right now, your father's doing a poor job of earning any." The boy's smirk faded. Richard's face turned crimson. He turned to Sophie, shouting, "I want this man removed. He's aggressive. He's making my family unsafe. Call your supervisor. File a report. Ban him from this airline." The words aggressive and unsafe cut like knives. Everyone in the industry knew what they meant: escalation, security involvement, permanent bans. Sophie's eyes widened in panic. She looked at David, then at the family, caught between truth and the weight of their privilege, David sat perfectly still. He wasn't worried, because he knew something the Whitmores didn't. The supervisor who would soon arrive wasn't just an employee. He was a man David had personally hired years ago. A man who knew exactly who David Cole was. The Whitmores thought they had cornered him, but they had just set the stage for their own undoing. The boarding lounge had shifted into an uneasy silence after Richard Whitmore's demand to have David Cole removed. Travelers who had come only to wait for their flight now found themselves unwilling witnesses to a spectacle. The quiet man with the weathered jacket was no longer invisible. The Whitmores had made sure of that. Elaine leaned closer to her husband, her voice sharp enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Richard, this is absurd. We should not have to sit next to someone like him. Look at this place. Everyone is staring. Handle it." Her words carried that familiar mix of disdain and insecurity. The tone of someone who had lived too long, wrapped in privilege to imagine a world where her comfort wasn't guaranteed. Richard puffed out his chest again, fueled by the attention. He wasn't about to back down. "Don't worry, darling," he said with a tight smile. "This is nothing. I'll take care of it." He turned toward Sophie, who was still clutching her tablet, trying to maintain a professional stance even though her knuckles had gone white. "Call your supervisor," Richard demanded. "Now. I want this man escorted out. My family and I are not safe sitting here." Sophie hesitated. She glanced at David, whose calm gaze met hers once more. There was no fear in his eyes, no desperation, only patience, the kind that felt heavier than anger. I'll contact my supervisor," she said softly, her voice almost apologetic. She stepped back toward the counter and reached for her radio. Elaine sat back with a triumphant sigh, pulling her daughter Chloe closer. "Finally. I told you, Richard. Sometimes you just have to push these people. They don't move unless you make them." Chloe nodded absently, still holding her phone up. She had been live-streaming the encounter without anyone noticing. Her followers flooding the comments with fire emojis and half-baked jokes, but a few of them weren't laughing. They were typing things like, "This feels wrong and that man looks too calm for this to end well." Bradley slouched in his chair, smirking. "Dad's gonna have him out of here in minutes. People like that don't last when someone like us complains." David heard it all. He'd been hearing versions of it his whole life. People like that. People like you. Too often the phrase was used not to describe character, but skin, clothes, accents, paychecks. He breathed slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth. He remembered Samuel Green once telling him, "The higher you climb, the more wind will try to knock you down. Don't bend, root yourself." So David stayed rooted. Across the lounge, passengers whispered. A woman in a gray coat shook her head in disgust at the Whitmores. A young man with headphones slipped them off and muttered to the stranger beside him, "This is messed up." The Whitmores, oblivious to the ripple of judgment forming around them, continued their theater. Elaine dabbed her hands again with sanitizer, as if David's quiet presence were a contagion. Richard checked his watch, exhaling loudly as though even waiting for the supervisor was beneath him. It was the kind of arrogance that wasn't loud only in words. It seeped into every gesture, every sigh, every glance. David sat still, but inside, he allowed himself to feel the weariness of it. He thought about how exhausting it was to live in a world where, even at the height of achievement, he could still be reduced to a stereotype the moment he stepped out of a tailored suit. He thought about how often black men like him had been labeled aggressive for simply existing. How many doors had been slammed shut with those words. And then he thought of Samuel's funeral, of the people he would see there, old co-workers, men with thick hands and tired backs, who had built bridges and skyscrapers with him, men who had taught him that strength wasn't in loudness, but in endurance. He wished Samuel could see him now. The sound of heels clicking against the polished floor drew everyone's attention. Sophie had returned from the counter, her radio clipped to her hip. She stood nervously near the Whitmores, glancing at David with something like an apology in her eyes. "Supervisor Harris is on his way," she announced quietly. Richard nodded, satisfied. Good. Maybe someone with authority will finally listen. Elaine leaned closer to her daughter, whispering in a voice just loud enough to carry, "This is what happens when you let just anyone in these spaces. No standards, no rules. If we don't keep the line, the whole system collapses." Chloe kept recording, her live feed picking up every word. A few viewers began screen capturing the video, already sensing that it was a moment that might spread beyond a teenage live stream. Bradley snickered. "Watch. He'll be out on the curb in 10 minutes. David allowed himself a faint smile. Not at their words, but at their certainty. Certainty had always been the downfall of the arrogant. He reached down and adjusted the book resting on his backpack. Meditations. He thought of Marcus Aurelius writing about dignity and control even as Rome burned around him. Control. That was the key. Minutes dragged by. The lounge was no longer just a waiting room. It had become a stage. Passengers were the audience, caught between discomfort and anticipation. Some avoided looking directly, others watched intently. The hum of conversation had shifted, whispers growing into murmurs. And then, finally, a tall man in a navy suit strode through the gate doors. Michael Harris, the operations supervisor. His pace was brisk, his expression strained from a day already filled with delays and demands. "Supervisor Harris," Richard called before Michael could even take stock of the scene. He thrust out a business card as though offering a royal decree. "Richard Whitmore, senior partner at Whitmore Capital. My family and I are first-class passengers, and we've been subjected to harassment by this man. He refuses to move. We do not feel safe. I want him removed immediately." Michael accepted the card, his eyes flicking over the embossed gold letters, but then his gaze lifted to David, and everything about him changed. His professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second. His eyes widened, recognition flooding his face. He straightened his tie, his tone shifting instantly from routine professionalism to something else entirely. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice catching. "Sir, I had no idea you were traveling today." The entire lounge froze. Richard blinked, confused. You know him." Michael didn't answer. His eyes remained locked on David, his posture stiffening as though he were standing in front of a commanding officer. "Is everything all right, sir? Do you need any assistance?" Elaine frowned, glancing between them. "Wait. What's happening? Why are you?" David raised a hand, silencing the swirl of voices. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but carrying, "I'm fine, Michael, but thank you." Richard's confidence faltered. His face flushed with confusion. He looked from David to Michael, then back again. "What is this? Who exactly are you?" David didn't answer right away. He let the question hang, let the tension thicken. The weight of silence was more powerful than any explanation. Finally, he spoke. "You'll find out soon enough." The Whitmores had wanted a supervisor to put David in his place. What they hadn't realized was that David Cole had already built the place. Michael Harris stood frozen for a beat too long. The gate lounge, thick with whispers, seemed to lean in on him, waiting for the next words out of his mouth. He had been called countless times to deal with disputes between passengers, but never one like this. Never with David Cole in the middle of it. Richard Whitmore sensed the hesitation and pounced. "You see," he said, gesturing at David, "even your supervisor can't deny this. This man is out of place here. My wife and children feel threatened. We paid for first class, and that should mean something. You people can't just let anyone bring down the standards of this airline." Michael's jaw tightened. He wanted to answer immediately, to put Richard in his place, but his loyalty to David and his own professionalism kept him still for a moment longer. He turned toward David, his expression softening. "Mr. Cole, sir," Michael said carefully, "is there an issue here that requires my intervention?" The lounge gasped at the formality in his tone. The title, "sir," hung in the air like a thunderclap. Elaine blinked rapidly, confusion cutting through her mask of superiority. "Why are you addressing him like that? He's clearly not." Her voice trailed off under the weight of Michael's sharp glance. David's calm never wavered. He leaned forward, hands folded together, and spoke evenly. "There's no issue on my part. Michael, I have my boarding pass. I am in the correct area. The only problem is a family who cannot seem to sit quietly while others wait for their flights." Richard's face flushed deep red. "That's outrageous. You're twisting this around. You're the one making my family unsafe. Look at him. Elaine, look how aggressive he is. You people always." He stopped short. A few passengers had pulled out their phones more openly now, their cameras aimed squarely at the Whitmores. The pressure of being recorded began to crack through Richard's bluster. Sophie's voice, though quiet, found strength in the pause. "Mr. Cole has every right to be here. His ticket is valid. He hasn't raised his voice once. He's been nothing but respectful." Elaine turned on her, eyes sharp. "Do you know who my husband is? Do you have any idea how much influence he carries? We could have your job in minutes." Sophie swallowed hard, her pulse quickening, but before fear could take root, David spoke again. "Miss Tran," he said gently, "you don't need to defend me. You've done your job fairly. That is all anyone can ask." His words steadied her. She nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Richard was less steady. He looked between Michael and David, realizing something was slipping beyond his control. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Who exactly are you?" Michael opened his mouth, but David raised a hand to stop him. "You'll have your answer soon enough," David said. His tone was calm, but it carried an edge that silenced the lounge. The quiet stretched. Passengers sat frozen, unsure whether they were watching a heated argument or the opening act of something larger. And then Bradley, still emboldened by arrogance, broke the tension with a sneer. "Dad, why are you wasting time with this guy? He's nothing. Just a broke old man clinging to some cheap book." The insult stung not because it was cruel, but because it was so hollow. David's eyes flicked briefly to the boy, then down to the book on his lap. Meditations. He thought again of Marcus Aurelius's words. "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." He rose slowly to his feet. The motion was quiet, deliberate, but it carried the weight of authority. He stood tall, shoulders broad, silver hair catching the fluorescent light. For the first time, the lounge seemed to see him as more than just a passenger. He looked like a man used to giving orders, used to being listened to. Richard instinctively stepped back half a pace. David's voice was calm, but carried a resonance that filled the space. "I have no quarrel with you or your family, Mr. Whitmore. But your words, your actions, they expose more about you than they do about me. You've mistaken quiet for weakness. You've mistaken humility for insignificance. That is your error, not mine." The words landed heavily. Elaine fidgeted with her handbag. Chloe lowered her phone slightly. Even Bradley seemed less certain. Michael cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore," he said firmly now. "Mr. Cole has every right to remain here. If you or your family continue to harass him, you will be the ones escorted out." The murmurs in the lounge swelled, a wave of approval rippling through the crowd. Richard's jaw dropped. "What? That's absurd. Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea what kind of contracts my firm handles?" Michael didn't flinch. "I know exactly who you are, but you clearly don't know who Mr. Cole is." The room leaned forward at those words, anticipation tightening like a drum. David met Michael's eyes. A silent understanding passed between them. "Not yet." David's look seemed to say, "Let them stew a little longer." Michael nodded subtly and took a step back. His arms crossed. Richard sputtered, gesturing wildly. "This is madness. Complete madness. I will not be humiliated by some nobody with a discount ticket." David tilted his head slightly, his voice soft. "Then perhaps you should consider why you feel humiliated at all." For the first time since the ordeal began, Richard had no reply. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't just tension. It was the beginning of realization, though the Whitmores didn't yet understand what kind. Passengers exchanged glances. Phones kept recording. The atmosphere shifted, heavy with the sense that something bigger was coming. David sat back down, his composure unbroken. He picked up his book again, opening to a page marked by a torn receipt. His voice was barely above a whisper, but Sophie, standing close, heard it clearly. "Endure, but never bow." She didn't know if he was quoting the book or himself, but the words stayed with her long after. The Whitmores had tried to shrink him with ridicule, but, in doing so, they had made him larger in everyone's eyes, and the story was only beginning. The Whitmores were shaken, but not broken. Richard paced in front of the row of seats, his voice still raised though his words had lost some of their edge. Elaine whispered frantically in his ear, while Bradley slumped deeper into his hoodie and Chloe kept half her face hidden behind her phone. They were no longer the picture of untouchable wealth. They were flailing, grasping for the authority that had always worked for them before. The other passengers felt it. Something was shifting. They had watched David Cole stand calmly against insults that would have broken most people, and they had seen how the supervisor, Michael Harris, treated him with a respect that suggested something far greater than appearances. Curiosity buzzed like static. Phones stayed up, recording every moment, the lens of public judgment waiting for the reveal. Richard tried again, louder this time. "This isn't over. I will file a complaint with corporate. I will not let my family be subjected to this humiliation. That man," he jabbed his finger toward David, "will regret making me look like a fool." David didn't look up. His calm was unshaken, his book open again as though the chaos around him were merely background noise. That composure only enraged Richard more. People like him thrived on reaction, on others shrinking back. David gave him none of that. Silence was his weapon, and it cut deeper than shouting ever could. Michael stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, I strongly suggest you sit down. Your behavior is causing a disruption." "Disruption?" Richard barked. "I'm the customer. He's the disruption. He doesn't belong here. Just look at him." That was the moment Sophie spoke again, her voice trembling but clear. "Mr. Whitmore, with all due respect, you've been pointing fingers and raising your voice since you arrived. Mr. Cole has done nothing but sit quietly and answer respectfully when spoken to." Her courage sparked murmurs of agreement from nearby passengers. A woman in a red coat nodded, saying, just loud enough to be heard, "She's right. He hasn't done a thing wrong." Another man muttered, "This is ridiculous." The tide was turning, and Richard could feel it slipping away. Elaine tugged at his sleeve, hissing through clenched teeth. "Richard, stop. People are staring. This is going too far." But Richard was too far gone. He puffed his chest, doubling down the only way he knew how. "You'll regret this," he warned Michael. "All of you will regret this. Do you even know who I am?" Michael's lips curved into something almost like a smile. "I do. Mr. Whitmore. But the better question is, do you know who Mr. Cole is?" The hush that fell over the lounge was sharp and immediate. Dozens of faces turned toward David, who still sat reading as if nothing in the world could disturb him. He let the pause stretch until it was almost unbearable, then gently closed his book. He placed it in his lap, his hand resting on the worn leather cover. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "You ask who I am. Very well. My name is David Cole. I am the founder and chief executive of Coalport Global, and, more relevant to all of you, I am the majority owner and operator of this very terminal you are standing in." Gasps filled the lounge, phones tilted higher, some passengers audibly whispering his name, recognizing it from news articles or business magazines. Elaine's face drained of color, her hand tightening around her Birkin bag until her knuckles whitened. Bradley's jaw dropped, and Chloe finally lowered her phone, her eyes wide. Richard blinked rapidly, the blood draining from his face. You're lying." Michael straightened his tie. "No, Mr. Whitmore, he's not. David Cole is the man who built Aurora International Terminal from the ground up. Every gate, every corridor, every system here bears his imprint. And you've spent the last half hour insulting him in front of an audience and several cameras." The shift in the air was seismic. The crowd's energy transformed from tension to astonishment, from pity for David to admiration. The quiet man in the old leather jacket was no longer invisible. He was revealed as the giant in the room. David's eyes never left Richard. "I didn't need to say it," he said softly. "I preferred not to. But sometimes the truth must be spoken plainly." He leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying enough weight to silence every whisper. "You saw an economy ticket and thought it told you my worth. You saw worn boots and assumed you knew my story. But wealth is not worn on a sleeve, character is not measured in fabric, and dignity cannot be stripped away by sneers." The words hit Richard like blows. He swayed on his feet, caught between rage and collapse. Elaine muttered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Bradley and Chloe sat frozen, For once, without a single comeback, the passengers erupted into applause, not loud at first, but steady, building as more hands joined in. Sophie felt tears prick her eyes as she clapped too, relief and pride mixing inside her chest. For once, justice wasn't whispered in hallways or hidden in apologies. It was spoken aloud, undeniable. Richard turned toward the applauding crowd, his face pale with horror. This is absurd. You don't understand. His words drowned beneath the sound of hands meeting, the rhythm of approval that left him powerless. David rose again, tall and steady, his presence commanding the entire lounge. He looked around at the faces before him, then back at Richard. This terminal is a place where millions pass through. Every one of them deserves dignity, whether they sit in first class or economy, whether they wear designer suits or old jackets. If you cannot understand that, Mr. Whitmore, then perhaps you are the one who does not belong here. Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Elaine covered her face with her hand. Bradley slouched low, trying to disappear. Chloe stared blankly, phone forgotten in her lap. David turned toward Sophie. Miss Tran, thank you for your professionalism. You handled yourself with grace. His gaze moved to Michael. And thank you for stepping in. Michael inclined his head, his voice low but reverent. Always, sir. David's calm settled over the room once more. He picked up his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and nodded toward the boarding doors. Now, let's get these passengers where they need to go. The crowd erupted again, not just applause this time, but cheers. Phones captured every moment, streams already going live to social media. The Whitmores, once the self-proclaimed rulers of the lounge, sat in silent disgrace, their empire of arrogance crumbling in real time. And David Cole walked forward, unshaken, carrying with him the quiet power that no insult could touch. The applause faded slowly, replaced by a buzz of whispered conversations. Phones were still raised, streams still live, but now every lens pointed squarely at the Whitmores. The family who had strutted into the lounge draped in arrogance was now cornered, their power stripped bare by truth. Richard's chest heaved as he looked around, desperate for someone to take his side. Elaine tugged at his sleeve, whispering furiously, but he shook her off. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding his father's gaze, while Chloe stared blankly at the floor. The empire of entitlement they had built around themselves was collapsing, brick by brick, in front of strangers. David Cole, meanwhile, remained calm. He had seen men like Richard many times before in boardrooms, on construction sites, in city hall chambers, men who believed wealth was a shield, that loudness equaled power. They always underestimated silence. They always mistook humility for weakness. David looked down at his watch. There was still time before boarding resumed. He knew what came next. Justice, yes, but not vengeance. A lesson had to be taught, and it had to be clear. Michael Harris leaned in, his voice low. Sir, do you want me to have them escorted out? David shook his head. Not yet. Let them see the weight of their actions. At that moment, Sophie's radio crackled. A voice from operations came through. Supervisor Harris, Mr. Cole, urgent matter, Mr. Chen on the line. Michael frowned. He passed the radio to David. David lifted it, pressing the button with steady fingers. Liam, what's happening? The voice that answered was brisk but edged with tension. David, we've got a crisis. A major electrical fault in Concourse A. Power grid's down. Flights at 5 gates are delayed. Systems are offline. Airlines are demanding immediate answers. Gasps rippled through the passengers who overheard. Richard smirked faintly, a flicker of false triumph returning. See, even your precious terminal can't function. Maybe you're not as competent as you think. David turned slowly, his gaze resting on Richard. Competence isn't never facing problems, it's knowing how to solve them. He pressed the radio again. Liam, reroute auxiliary power from Concourse C, engage emergency generators, keep passengers updated every 15 minutes, food vouchers distributed immediately. I'll be there in 10. Yes, sir. David clipped the radio back to his belt. His calm was so absolute that even the worried passengers began to breathe easier. Richard, however, wasn't done. He puffed out his chest, raising his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. This is exactly what I mean. You let people like him run things, and the whole system breaks down. My firm, Whitmore Sterling Capital, handles risk assessment projects bigger than this. If I were in charge, none of this would happen. He glanced around, seeking approval. None came. Phones zoomed closer. Elaine buried her face in her hands. David studied him for a moment, then spoke quietly. Your firm, Mr. Whitmore, submitted a bid for the new Aurora Cargo Hub project, didn't it? The words hit Richard like a punch. He froze. How do you know about that? Michael answered for him, his voice cool. Because Mr. Cole sits on the review board for that contract. Every decision passes through his hands. The silence that followed was electric. Passengers leaned forward, sensing the twist unfolding before their eyes. Sophie's eyes widened, realization dawning. The man Richard had insulted wasn't just a traveler, he was the gatekeeper to Richard's future. David's voice was steady, almost gentle. You see, Richard, arrogance blinds. You mocked a stranger, not realizing that stranger held your company's fate in his hands. You belittled me over an economy ticket while begging for a contract worth billions. Richard stammered, his face pale. Wait, Mr. Cole? I didn't know. This was a misunderstanding. You can't. David raised a hand, silence in him. What I cannot do is ignore character. Business is built on trust, and trust cannot live where arrogance thrives. The passengers erupted again, murmurs rising to cheers from some. Phones captured every word, every expression. The Whitmores shrank further, their dynasty unraveling in real time. Elaine whispered, tears streaking her mascara. Richard, stop. Please, it's over. But Richard couldn't stop. He stepped forward, desperation seeping into his voice. Mr. Cole, I can fix this. I'll apologize. Make amends, whatever you need. Don't destroy my career over this. David regarded him, his eyes steady but not cruel. I'm not destroying your career. Richard, you are. I'm only refusing to build my house on your foundation. He turned to Michael. Make note. Whitmore Sterling Capital is disqualified from all current and future bids with Coalport Global. Michael nodded sharply. Understood. Richard collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. Elaine wept silently beside him. Bradley and Chloe sat stiff, finally realizing their world would never look the same again. David looked at Sophie. Keep boarding procedures calm. Make sure passengers get what they need. Yes, sir, she said, her voice steady now, filled with new confidence. David slung his backpack over his shoulder. As he moved toward the concourse to deal with the electrical crisis, he paused, turning back one last time. "To everyone here," he said, his voice carrying through the lounge. "Remember, this respect costs nothing, but the lack of it can cost you everything." The passengers clapped again, this time louder, more unified. The sound followed David as he walked away, his figure strong and steady against the backdrop of the glowing terminal. The Whitmores sat in silence, drowning in the echo of their own downfall. The Whitmores sat in silence, each one drowning in their own storm. Richard's face was ashen, the reality of his downfall pressing in from all directions. Elaine dabbed at her ruined mascara, while Bradley and Chloe huddled into themselves, for once too ashamed to even touch their glowing phones. But the rest of the lounge was alive. Passengers whispered excitedly, their phones still raised, sharing the drama that was unfolding right before their eyes. Clips had already been uploaded, spreading across social media faster than wildfire. Hashtags appeared within minutes. Aurora Terminal. Respect costs nothing. David Cole. One video, captured from a perfect angle, showed Richard standing over David, shouting, while David remained calm, seated with his book. The caption read, "They mocked a man with an economy ticket. Turns out he owns the terminal. It hit 1 million views in under an hour." Sophie felt her heart pound as she scrolled on her break phone. She knew she shouldn't be checking, but she couldn't resist. Her fingers trembled as she watched herself appear on one of the clips, defending David in front of the Whitmores. The comments flooded beneath the video. "Shout out to that gate agent. She kept it real. She's a hero. Give her a raise. This woman deserves a promotion." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. All day she had carried the weight of being invisible, of being the one caught between entitled customers and the rules of the airline. And now, strangers across the internet saw her, not as a servant, as someone brave. Richard noticed the passengers buzzing and finally realized what was happening. His eyes darted to the glowing screens. "Turn those off," he shouted. "You can't record me without permission. This is illegal." No one listened. The tide of public opinion was already against him. Elaine grabbed his arm. "Richard, please. People are filming. Just stop talking." But Richard never knew how to stop. He rose to his feet again, his voice booming with desperation. "You think this is the end? Do you know how many people I know? Do you know how many contracts I control? This man can't ruin me with a single word." His outburst only sealed his fate. Cameras caught every second of it, his words painting him as arrogant and blind to reality. Meanwhile, David was already deep in action. He had walked into the operations corridor with Michael at his side, his mind sharpening as he shifted from confrontation to problem-solving. The electrical failure in Concourse A was serious, but it was solvable. As they approached the control room, engineers scrambled around panels of blinking lights and humming machines. The air smelled faintly of ozone. David greeted them with steady authority. "What's the status? Main grid is compromised," one engineer explained. "We've rerouted partial power, but full restoration will take hours." David nodded. "Keep the reroute stable. Prioritize life safety systems and boarding gates. I'll handle passenger management." He turned to Michael. "Announce a 2-hour delay. Be transparent. Honesty earns patience. And make sure every stranded passenger has food and drink vouchers." Michael moved quickly, already relaying orders into his headset. David paused, surveying the room. He had spent decades building this terminal, brick by brick, system by system. Problems never frightened him. What mattered was how you responded. Back in the lounge, Sophie listened to Michael's announcement echo through the speakers. Passengers groaned, but relief softened the frustration. At least they were being told the truth. At least they weren't being ignored. She watched as staff members moved through the crowd with stacks of vouchers. People took them with grateful nods. The atmosphere calmed. The respect David had spoken of was already taking root. But the Whitmores were crumbling. Elaine leaned close to her husband, her voice shaking. "Richard, it's over. Look around you. Everyone saw. Everyone knows. Please, just stop." Richard shook his head stubbornly, gripping the handle of his briefcase like it was a lifeline. "No, this isn't the end. I can fix this. I'll call Croft. He'll smooth it over." "He always does," Bradley muttered under his breath, bitterness creeping into his tone. "Dad, you don't get it. This is all over the internet. Everyone at school's gonna see this. We're ruined." Elaine glared at her son, but she couldn't deny the truth. The humiliation was no longer contained in a lounge. It was global, irreversible. Hours later, when flights finally resumed, the Whitmores boarded quietly. Gone was the arrogance, the loud demands. They walked with heads bowed, shadows of the people they had been just a few hours before. Passengers filmed them again, capturing the sight of their downfall. David, standing near the boarding doors, didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or revel in their collapse. He simply nodded to Sophie and Michael, ensuring operations continued smoothly. His lesson had been delivered. The world had witnessed it. Nothing more needed to be said. But the consequences were only beginning. By the next morning, news outlets had picked up the story. National headlines ran with the viral clips. "Arrogant banker humiliates himself after insulting terminal owner." Talk shows debated the meaning of respect in public spaces. Business analysts whispered about what this meant for Whitmore Sterling Capital, and inside a towering office in Manhattan. Richard's senior partner, Julian Croft, sat with the morning paper spread across his desk. The headline screamed from the page. His jaw tightened as he watched the video play on his laptop. Richard's voice dripping with disdain. His insults replayed in endless loops. He didn't bother calling Richard. The decision was already made. David Cole, meanwhile, sat in his modest office overlooking the runway. He sipped a black coffee, his phone buzzing with messages from reporters and business leaders alike. He ignored most of them. Fame wasn't his pursuit. Character was. Sophie knocked gently on his door. "Mr. Cole, I just wanted to thank you for standing up the way you did, and for saying what you said about dignity." David smiled softly. "You don't need to thank me, Sophie. You already stood up when it mattered. That took more courage than most people will ever know." Her cheeks flushed, but she smiled back. For the first time in her young career, she felt seen, truly seen. Michael entered next, a tablet in his hand. "Sir, the videos have gone global. We're talking tens of millions of views. The whole world knows what happened." David set down his coffee. "Then the whole world has learned the lesson. That respect costs nothing, but the lack of it can cost everything." He leaned back in his chair, looking out at the planes taking off into the horizon. The terminal hummed with life. A city within a city. A place where millions of stories unfolded every year. And he knew, deep in his bones, that his job wasn't just to keep the lights on. It was to guard the dignity of every soul who walked through those doors. For him, that was the true measure of wealth. Morning sunlight cut through the tall glass walls of Aurora Terminal, casting long golden beams across the polished floors. Travelers bustled as usual, but the echoes of last night's drama lingered. Screens in coffee shops played clips of David Cole's confrontation with the Whitmores. Strangers still whispered his name as they passed, pointing discreetly toward the office towers that overlooked the runways. David sat at his desk, calm as ever, reviewing operational reports. For him, the work never stopped. Crises came and went, planes took off, planes landed. People came through his terminal with joy, with sorrow, with hope. His job was to keep that flow moving, to make sure dignity guided every detail. The fame from the viral videos meant little to him. But for Richard Whitmore, the storm had only begun. In the heart of Manhattan, the offices of Whitmore Sterling Capital were buzzing with tension. Executives huddled in glass-walled conference rooms, voices low but urgent. Screens displayed news sites plastered with Richard's name and face. The clips of him sneering at David Cole, dismissing him as a charity case, looped endlessly on social media. Julian Croft, the senior managing partner, sat in silence at the head of the boardroom table. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were hard as stone. At last he spoke. "Richard has made us a global laughingstock." The words landed heavily. No one dared respond. Croft continued, his tone cold. "We were in the final stages of securing the Aurora Cargo Hub bid, a project that would have brought billions into this firm, and now disqualified, publicly, permanently." He turned his gaze toward Richard, who sat slumped in a leather chair, his briefcase on the floor by his feet. The arrogance that had once fueled him had drained away. His suit looked rumpled, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Julian, please," Richard began, his voice cracking. "This was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who he was. I can fix this. I'll apologize publicly. Croft cut him off with a raised hand. You don't understand. This isn't just about Mr. Cole. The videos show your character. They show the world exactly who you are, and that is something no apology can erase." A silence stretched across the room. Richard's breathing quickened. He looked around the table, searching for an ally, but every face was turned away. Croft delivered the final blow, effective immediately. "Your partnership is terminated. Security will escort you out. You may clear your desk this afternoon." Richard's world collapsed in that instant. Years of building, scheming, climbing, it all dissolved into nothing. He tried to protest, but the words died in his throat. 2 guards appeared quietly at the door. Elaine's voice echoed in his head, pleading with him to stop back at the lounge, and he realized too late that she had been right. The empire of entitlement was gone. Back at Aurora, David was already moving forward. Sophie knocked gently on his office door, holding a small stack of envelopes. "These came for you," she said. "Letters from passengers. Some of them just wanted to thank you for what you said yesterday." David looked up, surprise flickering across his face. He took the envelopes and opened the first. It was handwritten, scrawled by someone in a hurry. "Mr. Cole, I was at the gate yesterday. My son saw what you did, and he asked me why the man in the old jacket was so strong even when people were mean. I told him strength isn't about shouting, it's about knowing who you are. Thank you for showing him that." David folded the letter carefully and set it aside. He opened another, then another. Each one carried gratitude, admiration, or simply relief. Relief that dignity had been defended in a place where it so often went ignored. He looked up at Sophie. Sometimes one act of respect teaches more than 100 speeches. She smiled. You didn't just defend yourself yesterday. You defended all of us. Later that afternoon, David walked the terminal floor as he always did. He moved quietly, observing. He watched a janitor polishing the metal rails near security, and he stopped to thank him personally. He watched a family struggling with heavy bags, and he carried one for them to the counter. He didn't announce who he was. He didn't need to. His presence was felt in the way he acted, in the way he listened. Meanwhile, far away in their estate, the Whitmores were unraveling. Elaine sat in silence at the kitchen table, scrolling through endless feeds of news and videos. The ridicule was merciless. Commentators mocked their arrogance. Memes turned their outbursts into punchlines. Their children, once proud of their elite status, now faced humiliation online. Bradley's classmates sent him the viral clip over and over. Chloe deleted all her accounts, unable to endure the flood of messages. Richard sat alone in his study, staring at a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. His phone lay dark on the desk. No partners called. No friends reached out. The silence was heavier than any insult he had ever thrown. For the first time, he faced the truth that money could not shield him. He had mistaken privilege for power, and it had slipped away in a single evening. David, on the other hand, felt no triumph. He sat quietly in his office that night, reflecting. He thought of his mother, who had worked 2 jobs so he could have books. He thought of the nights he'd spent on construction sites, exhausted but determined. He thought of every insult he had endured on his way up, and how none of them had broken him. And he thought of Sophie, who had stood up even when she could have stayed silent. In that moment, he knew the path forward. The incident was more than humiliation for a wealthy family. It was a mirror held up to society, showing how fragile dignity could be in the face of arrogance. David opened his laptop and began drafting a new initiative. He called it the Respect Mandate, a program that would ensure every worker, every passenger, every soul who passed through Aurora would be treated with dignity. Training would be expanded, policies rewritten, accountability enforced. But more than that, it would be a cultural change. A reminder that in the vast machine of travel and commerce, human respect mattered most. When he finished, he leaned back and closed his eyes. The work ahead would be hard, but he had never feared hard work. For Richard Whitmore, the reckoning had come. For David Cole, the work of building continued. News traveled faster than flights. By the second morning, every major network had carried the story of the confrontation at Aurora International. Some outlets focused on the spectacle of a wealthy family being humbled, but the more thoughtful voices dug deeper. They talked about dignity, about assumptions, about the quiet power David Cole had displayed when he chose restraint over rage. In coffee shops across the city, strangers debated the video. Office workers replayed the clip during lunch, marveling at how calm David had been under the barrage of insults. Parents showed it to their children as an example of standing tall without needing to shout. And across social media, quotes from David's words spread like wildfire. Respect costs nothing. You mistook humility for insignificance. Those lines became slogans, reminders etched into the public conversation. At Aurora, the atmosphere was different, too. Employees who had once felt invisible carried themselves a little taller. Baggage handlers nodded respectfully when David walked past, not out of fear, but out of admiration. Ticketing agents felt more confident refusing entitled demands, knowing leadership had their back. Even the passengers seemed to sense the shift. There was more patience, more awareness, as though the building itself carried the weight of what had happened. Sophie noticed it most. When she walked the concourse that day, more than one traveler stopped to thank her. A woman clasped her hand and said, "My daughter saw you on the video. She wants to be strong like you." Sophie's cheeks flushed, but she smiled, realizing her actions had meant more than she ever imagined. For the first time since joining the airline, she felt she wasn't just working a job. She was part of something bigger. David kept to his rhythm. He met with engineers about the electrical systems, reviewed contracts, and prepared plans for the respect mandate. He wasn't driven by the headlines or the applause. His compass was quieter, rooted in the lessons that had carried him from childhood to CEO. Never forget who you are, and never treat another person as less than human. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore's world unraveled further. His dismissal from Whitmore Sterling Capital made headlines of its own. Journalists camped outside his office, eager for a comment, but he slipped out a back exit, shoulders hunched, at home. Elaine refused to leave the estate, dreading the stairs. Bradley and Chloe faced ridicule online and at school. Their carefully curated image of superiority collapsed under the weight of viral humiliation. Richard called former allies, seeking sympathy. Few answered. Those who did kept conversation short, polite, but distant. Business had no room for scandal, and he had become poison overnight. His name no longer commanded respect, it carried derision. One evening, as he sat in his dim study, Elaine approached him with trembling hands. "Richard," she whispered, "we can't go on like this. We need to leave the city for a while. Let it blow over." He shook his head. "It won't blow over. Not this time." His voice cracked, the arrogance gone. I thought I could talk my way out of anything, but I underestimated him. I underestimated the world watching. Elaine placed a hand on his shoulder, but he barely felt it. For the first time, Richard realized what true power looked like. It wasn't the bluster of money or the sway of contracts. It was the quiet certainty of a man like David Cole, who didn't need to raise his voice to command the room. Back at Aurora, David held a private meeting with Michael and Sophie. The respect mandate draft lay on the table, its pages outlining new procedures and expectations. "It's not just training," David explained. "It's culture. Every person who comes through here must feel they belong. That means accountability at every level. Not just policies and binders, but action we live every day." Michael nodded. "We can implement check-ins at every shift. Collect feedback directly from passengers. Real-time accountability," Sophie added. "And maybe create a way for employees to report discrimination directly to leadership, without fear. I think people would feel safer." David smiled at her suggestion. "Good, that's exactly the kind of thinking we need." They spent hours refining the plan, shaping it into something tangible. By the time the meeting ended, the respect mandate was no longer an idea. It was a blueprint for change. Later that night, David walked the nearly empty terminal. The lights glowed softly, reflecting on the polished floors. He paused at gate 47, the very spot where Richard had tried to diminish him. He stood quietly, listening to the faint hum of the building. In that silence, he felt the echoes of every traveler who had ever walked these halls, the tired, the hopeful, the overlooked. He whispered to himself, "Endure, but never bow." The same words he had spoken that night. The story had begun with an insult over an economy ticket, but it had grown into something far larger, a reminder that dignity could not be bought, and that justice could come not through anger, but through truth revealed. And though the Whitmores had crumbled, David felt no triumph. What he felt instead was resolve. There would always be new battles, new people blinded by arrogance. But as long as he stood steady, others would find strength too. In a world so quick to measure worth by money and status, David Cole had shown another way, and that, he knew, would be his legacy. The respect mandate launched quietly, without the fanfare of press releases or staged announcements. David Cole never sought credit. He wanted the change to be lived, not advertised. Within weeks, the first signs appeared. Training sessions rolled out for every staff member, from senior managers to janitors. Posters in break rooms carried reminders in simple words: dignity first, respect costs nothing. Michael Harris oversaw implementation with relentless energy. He coordinated with supervisors, adjusted schedules, and checked compliance. Employees, at first skeptical, began to notice real differences. Complaints were addressed swiftly. Feedback was taken seriously. Those who had once felt invisible realized their voices mattered. Sophie felt the difference most. She attended the very first respect mandate session, sitting among colleagues in a plain conference room. The facilitator began by asking, "When was the last time you felt dismissed?" The stories poured out. A baggage handler recalled being ignored by managers. A ticketing agent spoke of constant verbal abuse from passengers. Sophie herself admitted she had often felt she had no right to speak up. The room grew quiet, and then the facilitator said, "Respect begins with listening, and today, someone is listening." She pointed to the back. David Cole stood there, silent but attentive, taking notes on every word. Sophie realized then that this wasn't a corporate performance. He truly meant it. Meanwhile, the world outside continued to churn. News outlets revisited the Whitmore story as more details emerged. Richard's termination from Whitmore Sterling Capital became public record. Analysts dissected how arrogance had cost him billions. Editorials debated the deeper message. Some focused on racial undertones, pointing out how quickly assumptions had been made about David's worth because of his appearance. Others emphasized class, status, and the fragility of power built on pride. For David, those discussions mattered, not because they praised him, but because they revealed how many people had endured similar wounds. Strangers sent him letters describing their own humiliations, being overlooked at work, dismissed at stores, ridiculed on flights. The pattern was painfully clear. One evening, David sat in his office with a small stack of these letters. He read slowly, pausing often. Michael entered quietly and placed a report on his desk. "Cargo hub contract updates," he said. David nodded, setting the letters aside, but Michael lingered. "You know, sir, these people writing to you, they see you as more than a businessman now. They see you as a voice." David looked out the window at the glowing runway. A voice is only useful if it speaks for more than itself. Michael understood. He had worked under David long enough to know his humility was real, but he also knew that humility carried weight. The world listened when David spoke, precisely because he did not speak often. At the same time, Richard Whitmore struggled in obscurity. With no firm and no allies, he retreated to his estate. Days blurred into nights. Elaine stopped attending social functions. Invitations had dried up anyway. Bradley grew bitter, lashing out at classmates who teased him. Chloe retreated deeper into silence, shutting herself away from the world. Richard paced his study, replaying the confrontation in his mind. He remembered the smirks on strangers' faces, the applause that followed David's words, the weight of being reduced from untouchable to pitied. Shame was a cloak he could not remove. He tried to draft letters of apology, but each attempt collapsed into bitterness. How could he apologize without admitting weakness? And yet he knew, deep down, that weakness had already been exposed. Back at Aurora, David continued walking the floors. He greeted custodians by name, asked food court workers about their families, listened to travelers vent about delays. Word spread that the owner cared. People felt it in the little things: cleaner halls, quicker responses, kinder staff. One day, as David walked past Gate 47, he saw a young man sitting alone, shoulders slumped. His clothes were neat but worn. A small duffel bag sat at his feet. David paused. First trip. The young man looked up, startled. "Yeah. How'd you know?" David smiled. "Everyone looks that way their first time." The boy hesitated, then asked, "Do you work here?" David chuckled softly. "Something like that." "Where are you headed? College?" "Full scholarship. But my mom couldn't come see me off. She's working a double shift." His voice cracked slightly. David nodded slowly, remembering his own mother working 2 jobs so he could study. "You'll make her proud," he said. "And remember, the worth of your ticket doesn't measure the worth of your journey." The boy frowned, confused, but the words seemed to settle somewhere inside him. David wished him luck and walked on, unnoticed by most. But for that young traveler, the moment would linger. The respect mandate spread beyond Aurora. Other terminals called, curious about the program. Airlines requested briefings. Politicians mentioned it in speeches. What began as a viral moment was becoming a movement. Subtle, but real. For David, it was not about fame or power. It was about ensuring no one else would have to endure what he had. It was about showing that respect could be built into the walls, into the systems, into the very culture of a place. And yet, late at night, he sometimes thought of Richard Whitmore, not with anger, but with a quiet sadness. Pride had destroyed him, but perhaps it didn't have to end that way. Perhaps even Richard could learn. Still, David knew he could not fight every battle. His role was to stand as proof that dignity was stronger than arrogance, that humility carried a weight louder than any insult. As the lights of Aurora Terminal glowed against the night sky, David sat back in his chair, watching the endless rhythm of flights. Somewhere out there, millions of people carried their own stories of struggle and resilience. His job was to make sure this place honored them all. And so the rebuilding began not just of trust in one terminal, but of something larger, a reminder that respect, though invisible, could shape the world more powerfully than money or fear. The weeks after the respect mandate rolled out became a test of patience, resilience, and clarity. David Cole had seen enough initiatives start strong only to fade when enthusiasm waned. He was determined this would not be one of them. Aurora Terminal buzzed with a different kind of energy now. Travelers noticed staff greeting them more warmly, even when lines stretched long. Small touches appeared everywhere, signs reminding passengers to treat workers with respect, supervisors present in waiting areas, and new kiosks where customers could leave feedback directly. The changes weren't flashy, but they were tangible. Sophie saw the difference in herself. Once timid, she now carried herself with quiet confidence. She knew if a passenger berated her, she had the authority and the backing to de-escalate without fear of reprisal. She no longer felt invisible. Each shift, she thought of that day when David Cole had sat at her gate, humiliated by arrogance but refusing to bend. Media outlets circled back to the story, fascinated by how it had evolved. Headlines shifted from the viral humiliation of the Whitmores to the cultural transformation at Aurora. Reporters wanted interviews, cameras wanted sound bites, networks wanted exclusives. David declined most requests. When pressed, he would only say, "This is not about me. It's about all of us." The restraint only deepened the intrigue. Talk shows dissected his words. Opinion writers debated whether humility could truly drive systemic change. Some doubted, calling it temporary theater. Others believed a genuine shift was underway. One morning, David received an invitation from a national broadcast program. The producer promised him full editorial control, a platform to address millions. Michael encouraged him to accept. "People want to hear your voice, sir," he said gently. "If you don't speak, others will speak for you." David considered the offer. He thought of his mother, who had once told him, "The right word at the right time can heal more than silence." After a long pause, he agreed. The interview aired on a Sunday evening. David sat across from the host in a simple studio, dressed in his usual blazer and open-collar shirt. The questions were direct. How did it feel to be mocked? Why didn't he reveal his identity sooner? Did he feel vindicated watching Richard Whitmore's downfall? David answered calmly, "It wasn't about me being mocked. It was about the assumption that a man's value could be measured by a ticket class, by the shine of his shoes. That assumption doesn't just hurt me. It hurts countless people every day." The host leaned forward, "And the Whitmores." David paused, his expression thoughtful. "Their downfall was not my doing. It was the consequence of their own choices. My responsibility was not to punish, but to make sure no one else would endure what happened that day. That's why we created the respect mandate, not for revenge, but for reform." The interview struck a chord. Social media lit up with praise. Clips went viral. But this time the focus was not humiliation. It was dignity. People shared stories of times they had been dismissed, overlooked, or belittled. The movement expanded beyond the airport. Restaurants, retail stores, even hospitals began to adapt the respect mandate principles. A wave of quiet change rippled outward. Yet not everyone embraced it. Critics sneered that it was soft policy or PR spin. Some executives argued that kindness was costly, slowing efficiency. David read these critiques carefully. Then he wrote a letter, published in a leading business journal. Efficiency without humanity is hollow. Profit without principle is unstable. The true measure of leadership is not how quickly we build, but how deeply we respect the people who build with us. The piece went viral, not for its eloquence but for its honesty. Workers printed it out and taped it in break rooms. Leaders quoted it at conferences. Ordinary readers said it felt less like a corporate statement and more like advice from a trusted friend. Meanwhile, the Whitmore family sank deeper into obscurity. Elaine avoided public places, terrified of whispers. Bradley withdrew from school, his arrogance replaced with sullenness. Chloe, once glued to her phone, deleted her social media accounts after waves of online ridicule. Richard remained the most haunted. He scoured newspapers, searching for mentions of his name, only to find silence. Once courted by networks and investors, now he couldn't get a call returned. The silence was louder than shame. One night, unable to sleep, Richard drove to Aurora. He parked far from the main entrance, wearing a hat low over his eyes. He walked through the terminal he once believed he owned by proxy of wealth, now knowing it belonged in spirit to the man he had mocked. He watched workers laughing together, managers greeting passengers warmly, travelers moving with less tension. A large screen displayed a quote attributed to David Cole. "Every journey deserves respect." Richard stood there, aching with the weight of what he had lost. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the empire he had built on entitlement had been nothing more than glass. And when it shattered, there was nothing to hold on to. He considered approaching David, but the thought of being seen stopped him. Pride still clung, fragile but stubborn. So he turned and walked back into the night, a man both punished and imprisoned by his own choices. Back in his office, David reflected on the journey. He knew the work was not done. Change was fragile, but the sight of employees standing taller, of passengers smiling more often, of a culture where respect was not demanded but given freely, that gave him hope. And in that hope, he found peace. The first winter snow dusted Aurora Terminal in a thin white blanket. From his office window, David Cole watched the flakes drift past the glass, melting into rivulets on the steel beams below. The airport never slept, never slowed. Its rhythm beat on no matter the season. But inside David, there was a quiet sense of completion. It had been 6 months since the day at Gate 32 when his dignity had been tested. In that half year, so much had shifted not only within Aurora, but across the country. The respect mandate had spread far beyond what anyone expected. Universities studied it, citing it as a model of organizational culture. Community centers borrowed its principles for local programs. Even corporate giants released statements pledging to follow suit, though David knew words mattered less than deeds. At Aurora, the results spoke louder than any report. Passenger satisfaction climbed to record highs, employee turnover dropped sharply, complaints of mistreatment dwindled. More important than numbers was the atmosphere lighter, warmer, more humane. People noticed, and they carried the memory home. Sophie embodied the change. She had risen quickly, promoted to supervisor within months. She still worked the floor, not out of duty, but because she loved the human connection. When passengers grew restless during delays, she met them with calm words, remembering how it once felt to be powerless. She became not only a manager, but a mentor, training others to lead with empathy. Michael Harris thrived as well. He embraced his role as director of operations, balancing efficiency with respect. His loyalty to David deepened, not out of obligation, but from witnessing how leadership grounded in dignity transformed lives. He often joked that Aurora had become less of a workplace and more of a living lesson in humanity. The travelers felt it too. Families delayed by storms left with smiles because they were treated with kindness. Soldiers on leave received not only gratitude but genuine care. Children spilled juice on seats without being scolded, and cleaners were thanked for their work. Respect wove itself into the ordinary fabric of the day. One evening, David walked the concourse as he often did. He carried no entourage, no fanfare, just his worn leather jacket and steady gaze. Near Gate 19, he saw a janitor on her knees scrubbing a stubborn stain. Passengers passed by without a glance. David crouched beside her. "Tough one?" he asked. She looked up, startled, then laughed softly. "These coffee spills never go easy." David reached for a rag. "Mind if I help?" She hesitated, then handed him one. Together they worked until the stain faded. She shook her head, smiling. "Never thought I'd see the boss cleaning floors." David shrugged. Floors matter too. Moments like that, small and unnoticed, carried more weight than headlines. They reminded him why he had chosen this path, not for applause, but for humanity. Yet even as Aurora flourished, the Whitmores remained a shadow in the background. Their downfall had become a cautionary tale, retold in classrooms and op-eds. But to David, they were not villains carved in stone. They were people who had lost themselves to pride. One afternoon, as David reviewed reports, his assistant informed him someone was waiting in the lobby. It was Richard Whitmore. David considered refusing, but something in his chest urged otherwise. He instructed, "Send him in." Richard entered hesitantly, shoulders bent, eyes weary. He no longer looked like the imperious man who had once commanded attention with a snap of his fingers. He looked smaller, older. They sat across from each other in silence before Richard spoke. "I came, not to excuse myself. That day, I believed I was untouchable. I was wrong. I've paid for it, more than I thought possible." His voice cracked. "But my family, they've paid too. My children, my wife, they didn't deserve the fallout." David listened quietly. Richard's eyes glistened. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it. You deserved respect that day, and I failed to give it. I failed as a man, as a father, as a leader." For a long moment, David said nothing. The weight of history sat between them. Then he spoke, his tone steady. "Respect is not mine alone to demand. It belongs to everyone. Richard, what you took from me that day was not only dignity, it was an opportunity to honor yourself. Pride cost you more than you imagined." Richard nodded slowly, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I know." David leaned forward. "Your children can still learn if they see you take responsibility, not with excuses but with action. You can still teach them. That's where redemption begins." Richard looked at him, stunned. "You think it's possible?" David gave a faint smile. "I've seen stronger things rebuilt from ashes." The meeting ended without ceremony. Richard left with no promises, only the fragile seed of a chance. David did not know if he would nurture it, but offering the possibility was enough. Later that night, David stood once more at the window, watching planes lift into the sky. He thought of his mother, of long nights working construction, of Seamus O'Donnell's lessons about measuring twice and cutting once. He thought of the humiliation that had almost reduced him, and of the choice he had made to build rather than destroy. In the end, that was the legacy he wanted. Not wealth or ownership, but the culture he left behind. A place where every journey began with dignity, where respect was not a privilege but a given. Aurora Terminal was no longer just steel and glass. It was a testament to resilience, a cathedral of humanity disguised as an airport. And as long as its lights burned against the night, David believed the world could be a little kinder, a little more just. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "Respect is the foundation. Everything else is built on that." And with that, the circle closed not with vengeance, but with hope. The story of David Cole is not simply about wealth hidden beneath a worn jacket. It is about the quiet strength of dignity. Life often tempts us to judge by appearances a seat in economy, a jacket too old, a face lined with years. Yet true character is revealed not in what we wear, but in how we treat others. David's calm response to cruelty teaches us a timeless lesson. Dignity cannot be stolen unless we hand it away. Respect is not earned by shouting louder or flaunting wealth, but by carrying ourselves with humility, even in the face of insult. And when we choose reform over revenge, as David did with his respect mandate, we create ripples of change that outlast any single encounter. For older audiences who have seen the world's harshness firsthand, this story is a reminder. It is never too late to choose respect as the foundation of our interactions. In our homes, communities, and workplaces, we can measure twice and cut once, as David's mentor advised, not only in building structures, but in building human connections. Because in the end, our greatest legacy is not what we own, but the dignity we leave behind. Thank you for joining us on this journey of dignity, justice, and hope. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs the reminder. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep spreading stories that inspire respect, kindness, and courage in everyday life.